Chapter 22. New Men, New Crops, and New Ways. In the last chapter, we read the story of the difficult years 1838 to 52, when the British West Indian Islands were faced with shortage of labor, decreased production, falling prices, and loss of markets. We shall now read of the ways by which some of these difficulties were overcome, and how from about 1860, the islands began to enjoy a period of mild prosperity. First, let us see how the shortage of labor was overcome by means of immigration, that is, bringing laborers to the islands from other parts of the world. These laborers agreed to work for a certain number of years, and in return, they received a free passage in addition to their wages. There had been earlier attempts at immigration, such as bringing poor Irish and Scottish laborers and peasants from Northern Europe to the islands. But these people could not stand the change of climate, and great numbers died. Portuguese immigrants were unsatisfactory because after a short time they left the plantations and drifted to the towns where they engaged in petty trading and aroused the jealousy of the Negroes who made a living in that way. In 1838, immigrants from the East Indies of Asia were brought to the islands. The first parties of these immigrants were also unsatisfactory because they were not used to work on the land. But about 1850, new plans were made. The type of immigrant improved, and from that time, East Indians continued to come to the islands. So also did some Chinese. The government paid the passage money, and the newcomers promised to remain for 5 years. This was afterwards extended to 10 years, at the end of which their return passages were paid. Or if any were willing to settle in the colonies, they were given a sum of money and a grant of land. Between 1860 and 1870, East Indian immigration restored a steady supply of labor. But there were still numbers of Negroes employed on the plantations in various ways, especially on the smaller islands. At first, the Negro smallholders were unfriendly to the East Indians, but they soon ceased to resent the newcomers. In fact, the East Indians provided them with new customers for their products. However, this system of immigration came to an end in 1917. Besides the need for laborers on the plantations, there was also need for new plantation owners. As we read in the last chapter, many plantations were heavily in debt, and the planters were unable to raise further loans. Without more ready money, it was impossible to carry on the work. Some plantations were badly cultivated for lack of capital. Others were abandoned and left lying fallow or uncultivated at a time when the peasantry were beginning to prosper and needed larger holdings. To overcome these difficulties, the government arranged to take over estates that were deeply in debt. The land was sold and the proceeds divided among creditors. The new purchaser received the estate free of debt. This plan was of great advantage. It saved heavy legal expenses and secured a better price than would otherwise have been obtained. Besides, it gave a fresh start to the new owner. The plantations usually passed into the hands of men who had enough capital to work them properly. But in some cases, the new owner resold the estate in small lots to the peasantry. Thus, new capital, new owners, and new methods came to the islands. There were fewer absentee owners, that is, owners living in Europe, and of these, many were wealthy enough to equip their estates with the newest machinery, and thus brought prosperity to the islands. The new methods which were introduced by the new owners were also adopted by older planters who had survived the crisis. These methods were most advanced in the larger and newer plantations of Trinidad and of British Guiana, where steam and the vacuum pan methods were employed. This produced better sugar, but was costly, as coal had to be used to produce steam. There was also more use of up-to-date agricultural machinery, including plows and steam plows. The use of new fertilizers for the land was also introduced, especially guano from Peru. But when the soil was overworked, there was danger of the cane borer disease. These changes were of great advantage. The old methods had been very primitive, and only simple instruments had been used for breaking up the land. This was now done by the plow, horse hoe, and harrow. Later, the steam plow was introduced. Between 1860 and 1870, not only was the output of sugar increased, but new crops were also introduced. In Jamaica, rum began to be a valuable export. Coffee, pimento, ginger, and logwood were all important products, and these last were largely grown by the peasants on small holdings of land. Cinchona trees were planted in the Blue Mountains. The bark of these trees supplies the very valuable medicine known as quinine. In 1870, Captain Baker shipped the first cargo of bananas to Boston, and this was the small beginning of a trade which became of great importance to Jamaica in later years. In Dominica, the cultivation of limes for making lime juice was introduced, and this was later extended to Montserrat. Cocoa was successfully cultivated in Trinidad, Grenada, and Dominica. Coconuts, which grow best in sight and sound of the sea, were grown in British Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica, though less in Jamaica because that island lies in the path of the hurricanes. The great achievement of the descendants of the slaves was their steady settling on the land as small holders. In this way, they slowly began to create a peasantry that owned and cultivated their own plots of land. At first, the struggle of the ex slaves to obtain land on which to settle was a harsh one. It was only their own courage and the help mostly of missionaries which made this possible, as the planters were concerned in maintaining their supply of laborers for the plantations. The formation of these groups of peasant settlers, sometimes in free villages as they were called, was much more successful on some islands, such as Jamaica and Trinidad, than on others. This was because on those islands there was much free or uncultivated land on which to settle, whereas in Barbados, St. Kitts, and in most of the Leeward Islands, there was little land not already belonging to plantations. After 1685, After 1865, the island governments began at last to help the settlement of the people on the land. In Trinidad, for instance, crown lands, that is, lands belonging to the government, were sold in lots of 5 acres. Before this, they had been sold in large lots that single peasants had been unable to buy them. Then, about 1900, island governments were carrying out plans of settling people on the land. Thus, the importance of a free peasantry in the islands was at last realized. Crops especially suited for small holdings became important. In Grenada, where there were many peasant owners, cocoa began to take the place of sugar, and spices were also grown. Cocoa was also grown in Trinidad and Dominica. In Jamaica, there was a great variety of crops besides sugar. Coffee, pimento, ginger, and logwood, as well as bananas, can be grown on small holdings. Government grants also help to provide for the marketing and export of the produce of the small holdings. In British Guyana, the East Indian immigrants began the growing of rice, but for their own use rather than for export. In 1893, the Imperial Department of Agriculture for the West Indies was set up. Its chief object was to improve the cultivation of the sugarcane, and it introduced new canes, better methods of cultivation, and also new means of dealing with destructive pests to the great advantage of the islands. The department also aimed at introducing new crops in districts where conditions were not suited to sugarcanes. The chief stations of this Department of Agriculture are in Trinidad and in Jamaica. The West Indians themselves have given large sums of money for the work in addition to the imperial government grants. Another important advance has been to replace the many little old-fashioned sugar mills by large central factories which buy the canes from peasant farmers. 2 central factories were set up in Antigua in 1904. These, together with the central factory on St. Kitts, can deal with at least half the sugar grown in the windwards. There are also central factories in Jamaica. This new arrangement produces more sugar of a better quality and at a cheaper rate than was possible with the little old fashioned sugar mills. The building of special fruit ships has also been of great advantage to the West Indies. These ships have specially constructed compartments in which the fruit ripens slowly on the voyage without becoming rotten. In this way, citrus fruits, grapefruit, oranges, and limes, as well as bananas, can survive a long sea voyage.